On ABC Radio, this is The Conversation Hour.
And coming up on The Conversation Hour, you've got to say, actually, our two guests are two of the most interesting politicians within their systems. You are going to hear from, you've heard from him before, but you're going to hear from him in a different way. Sam Dastyari, the New South Wales Labor Senator, has written a book called One Halal of a Story, the ever self-promoting, effervescent energy bunny of politics. I was going to say at the left side of politics, but he kind of dominates the energetic stakes across the federal parliament. He will be joining us. He's here for the Writers' Festival. So that's your Australian politician. Shashi Tharoor will join us as well. You might not have heard of him. He had an extensive career at the United Nations. He is now a Congress MP in India. He has written this remarkable book. It's called Inglorious Empire. And his subtitle spells out exactly what the book is about, what the British did to India. It is a glorious description of all of the amazing ways that basically Britain ripped off India. That's my very Australian expression. My co-host, someone who's going to have far more intelligent questions than I, is Dr. Ranjana Srivastava, OAM. She's an oncologist. She's a Fulbright scholar, writer and broadcaster. Ranjana, welcome.
Morning, Raf.
So I did not know. You were born here and then you spent your childhood in India, is that right?
Yes, all my formative years in India. So my father is an academic and he was doing his PhD in Canberra when I was born. And we went back to India, as many people tended to do back then. You came here to study, but there was a very strong pull of one's native country. So, you know, a lot of students come here now and want to stay back. And I often asked my parents, and they said it never crossed our mind.
Right. So they were always Indian going home to India.
That's right. That's right. So I grew up in India. I studied, and then I subsequently moved around the world with my parents and ended up coming back to Melbourne to study medicine.
So you were in India, between the ages of what and what?
Between the ages of 2 and 16.
Okay. And where were you? Where were you living?
So it's a state called Bihar, and it's a town called Bhagalpur. Now, it's completely off the tourist track. Bihar continues to be one of the most socioeconomically deprived, crime-ridden states in India, very poorly resourced. And I must say that I had a very happy childhood there, despite all of that.
Why was it happy? What made it good? Was it just lots of family or something else?
Well, I think it was simple, Raf. It was, I mean, you know, it's a very interesting conversation to have with my children now where you know, I think several months ago or maybe last year, there was this word load shedding that was being used in Australia when the power cuts were going on. And you know, and there was a whole newspaper page on load shedding. And I had to laugh, and it said, "What is load shedding?" And I said, ask any Indian kid that, ask any Bihari child. We grew up with load shedding. There was no power. You know, we often spent months without electricity.
Yeah.
But we had, you know, there were a couple of good schools, and I think that made such a fundamental difference to my upbringing. And you know, I look back and I think to have grown up in a place with so little, people who came out of there did really well in terms of being resilient, in terms of being grateful for a lot of things. So yeah, it was a good childhood.
Do you feel like you're a product of many places, I suppose? So I just wonder, in your mind, what's the mental metaphor? Are you sort of straddling two identities? Are you a perfect blend of a few identities? How do you think of all of the different places that you've lived in?
Yeah. That came to my mind recently when I heard Theresa May said that if you say you are a global citizen, that's an excuse because you're not a citizen of anywhere. And I was quite confronted by that because I do feel when I'm in the UK where we spent some time, I think, it's kind of home, but not if I go back to India most years. I take my children back and there is this visceral sense of having arrived home.
So
and
India
then I
feels
come
more
to Melbourne
home?
and it feels like, I'm home again.
Yeah,
and
right.
I turn on the radio and I listen to your voice and it feels like I'm home. So I think it's really difficult to to parse, but I also think it's unnecessary. I've spent a lot of time in the United States. I finished high school there, and so I enter LAX airport like most of us do, and I think, it's nice to be back to a familiar place.
Look, I'm really excited to have Shashi Tharoor here. It's a great time to be talking about what the British did to India, because we've been having this amazing conversation about what the quote-unquote British did to Australia. To dive in at the deep end, Ranjana, were there parts of Shashi's book that you thought applied to the whole debate we're having? I don't even know what jumping off point to use, statues and Australia Day. Did it bring up any of that?
It did. I mean, it's such a topical book, and especially reading it this week, it brought to mind the whole relationship between Australia and its Indigenous population. We are arguing about when we were discovered, So yes, I think there are many parallels, and also around the world. I was reading two really interesting articles recently. One was about by a journalist who traveled, if you remember The Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad's book. So this journalist took the path 100 years later after it had been described in The Heart of Darkness.
England's greatest Polish writer.
And her conclusion was that many things had changed, but many things had stayed exactly the same and were just as dark and depressing, and the book could still be written today. And then a second piece was very different. It was about the relationship between Portugal and Angola, because Angola was colonized by the Portuguese, and how most of Angolan investment is now going into Portugal, and how the Portuguese government is kind of making all these concessions to attract that investment after having ravaged Angola. And there were politicians complaining that the government has a whole different set of rules for Angolan oil and Angolan investment or Angolan mining, etc. So really interesting. And I think Shashi's book about what the British did to India, I think, is applicable in so many ways to what other countries did and continue to do, by the way, to various populations. Oh,
we're so going to get to that. But it's just, I wasn't aware of the depths to which Britain had sort of sunk its talons into India and financially benefited. We will get to that. Ranjana Srivastava is my co-host on The Conversation Hour across Victoria. Raphael Epstein is my name. Shashi Tharoor is my next guest. He's here for the Melbourne Writers' Festival. Hasn't been at the Writers' Festival for decades. He worked at the UN for nearly 3 decades. He rose to the position of Under Secretary General. He is a Congress MP in India. His 16th book is Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi Tharoor, fantastic to have you in the studio. Welcome.
Very good to be with you, Raf. Thank you.
At the beginning of the book, you described this debate that you didn't put too much preparation into, and you talk about what the British did to India. And one of the lines at the beginning of the book that I love is that in that debate, your content was what I considered basic, but was unfamiliar to many, perhaps most, educated Indians. Does that mean most people in India are sort of not au fait with what's in your book?
Well, I'm surprised, but it seems to be the case, because the argument that I made, which was in an Oxford Union debate on British colonialism, suddenly went viral. All sorts of people seem to feel their eyes have been opened by this, whereas I thought I was saying something that everyone ought to know. And then my publishers talked me into writing the book, and it has done rather well in India. It's probably because people really didn't have all this information in one place before. So yes, I'm discovering either that people don't pay attention in class, or they're not teaching what I believe I learned going back to my school days.
I'm glad to see education standards are as much a hot topic of debate and history as they are here. I was trying to find some facts to hang my hat on, because to be honest, it's quite jaw-dropping, especially the beginning of the book. You write that at the beginning of the 18th century, India was almost a quarter of the world's economy. I think that's right. That by independence, India was just over 3%. So that one blew me away. And then you have a line, I've mangled it a little, but that Britain's industrial revolution was built on the destruction of Indian industry.
That's right, the deindustrialization of India. I mean, what people forget is that unlike, it's fair to say, Australia or Singapore, whatever, which were not exactly developed before the British got there, India was a developed, sophisticated civilization with a flourishing economy. It had been for over 2,000 years the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of textiles, going back to the Roman Empire. There are debates recorded by Pliny the Elder of Roman gold being sunk into India so that Roman women could enjoy Indian muslins and linens and cottons. And the fact is, thriving shipbuilding industry, an Indian invented steel, which the Arabs had borrowed to make the famous Damascus steel. All of this thriving in India that the British came in and systematically dismantled or destroyed in order to supplant it with their own manufactures of dubious quality that they then thrust into India, accompanied by a drainage of resources. Fortunately, the British kept pretty good accounts. So we know that every year there was a colossal sum of money being sent out of Indian taxation. So unlike any previous conqueror, they weren't spending in India what they'd looted in India. They were sending it off to England, just like the word loot, which they discovered in India, it's a Hindi word, and took into their dictionaries as well as their habits.
Loot and thug.
Speaking of an Indian education, Shashi, I mean, I do think, and I can attest to the fact that never in my Indian education did I gain as much information about how the British plundered India as your book. And I did find your book eminently readable. And I would actually say to anyone listening that the 9 pages of the preface do it justice alone. And, I think you could just read those 9 pages and feel informed. However, here is my question to you. So I read this book. It's witty, it's intellectual, it's incisive. You have a beautiful turn of phrase.
I sense a but coming here.
But it put me in mind. It brought to my mind my patients who become unwell. And they invest all this anger and emotion and energy in ruining the past. What they did, what could have been differently, what someone didn't diagnose, what would have happened if they'd had a pill before. And it kind of made me feel that as to, yes, it's important to know about our history, but then I'm riding here and I hear on the news, a building has collapsed in Mumbai. People have died because the building was no good and because it's monsoons. And it just makes me wonder whether all that intellect and energy will also go into a book about what to do now that we have moved on.
It already has, Ranjana. I mean, let me answer your question. I mean, first of all, I've written, as Raf mentioned, 15 other books, and most of them are indeed about what India should be doing in the future. India from Midnight to the Millennium, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. These are all books that focus much more on the present and the future. But this particular exercise in going back to the past is not about actually holding any rancor or bitterness. I believe strongly, both personally and as an Indian, that that's completely unproductive. And I would agree with Ranjana that nurturing hatred, resentment, bitterness, anger actually does you far more harm than the objects of your hatred, who remain essentially less affected by your hatred than yourself. The problem is, however, that we are too much of a forgive and forget culture. I want us to forgive because that rancor is unproductive, but I don't want us to forget. And the reason I don't want us to forget is that it seems to me that an appreciation of the past is indispensable to every human being in their personal lives, who are their parents, who are their grandparents, where they come from, and it's equally indispensable to a society. As I say to young people in India, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going?
I'm curious as well about... Well, let's begin with some of the rejoinders, actually. I mean, there's so many facts in there that blew me away, including the fact... People might think it's just the East India Company that do the pillaging, but when the Crown purchases India effectively from the East India Company, they bill the Indian taxpayer. It's kind of mind-blowing. But mind-blowing facts aside, you do address, okay, and this is an argument very familiar to Australians, lucky we got colonised by the British. Just give me that breakdown. Democracy, rule of law, free press, which are... things that are very British and that we share with India. Should India be thankful? You got those 3 things from Britain?
prize from the reluctant grasp of the colonialists. Let me go back a bit. But first, on the East India Company, it should be stressed that though the East India Company was a private corporation, and it was only in 1857 that the Crown officially took over, in practice, the East India Company was a mask for the British government. In fact, from the 1770s, that is a full 80 years before the Crown took over, the East India Company was working under the supervision of a board of Parliament. So, the British government was very much implicated in everything going on. The rulers, the governors general appointed by the East India Company were all pillars of the British establishment. So don't kid yourselves. The British were ruling as Britain and not just as a commercial corporation. But coming back to the specific things you say the British left behind, let me stress to begin with that entire first half, the British didn't make any bones that they were in it for the money. That was why the company mask was so useful. As a commercial corporation that justified itself in terms of returns to the shareholders, and that's all they were interested in. So they didn't really pretend to be doing any good. But when the Crown took over, then came the justifications. And of course, it coincided with the dawn and spreading of liberalism in England. So the English actually felt some guilt. They were developing liberal institutions, wider franchise. They had a free press, or increasingly free press. And needless to say, public opinion began to matter, and people weren't totally comfortable with some of the nastiness they were hearing back from India. So that's when the justification started being expressed. This was a civilizing mission, forgetting the fact that India was civilized when Englishmen were still running around in bearskins, that it was there for the benefit of the Indians. But fortunately, behind closed doors, the British were brutally honest with themselves. And they said bluntly, we're here for our benefit. We're ruling India for the benefit of Britain. As late as 1928, the British Home Secretary, Sir William Johnson Hicks, says behind closed doors, there's all this talk about us ruling India for the benefit of the Indians. That is complete cant and hypocrisy, he says. We seized India by the sword and we rule it by the yardstick, and we shall continue to do the same in Britain's interests. I've got the exact words in the book. That was the honest truth of what was going on. Now, when you speak about the things that Britain left behind, largely because they couldn't not leave it behind, they were going and they couldn't take these things with them, you will see that every single example that the British, or apologists for the British Empire can find, every single example was of something the British brought in for their benefit, for British profit or to enhance British control, which when they left it behind, Indians were able to profit from. So if you look at the railways, the classic British excuse, it was a complete colonial scam. First of all, it was built in order to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take it to the ports to ship our resources and raw materials to England for the factories there. Secondly, to send troops into the interior in order to quell any potential unrest. You also had indecent profits being made by British investors in Indian railways because they were guaranteed double the rate of return of the highest rewarding British government security at the time. So huge profits were made. They called it private profit at public risk, except the private profit was all British and the public risk was all the Indian taxpayer. Yeah. You had the rule of law you mentioned, but it was applied with excessive attention to the skin color of the defendant. So Englishmen killed Indians with impunity. In the entire 200 years of British rule, you can only find 3 cases in which Englishmen were convicted for murdering Indians. Otherwise, for example, an Englishman kicking an Indian servant to death, a very common instance, happened over a dozen times a year, was excused on the grounds that all Indians were really malarial, they had enlarged spleens, and so the Indians were dying of ruptured spleens, not of the kick. Punch magazine even published an ode to the stout British boot, which was the instrument of exacting such discipline. Democracy, the British consistently broke promises. The history of Britain and Indian relations from about 1885 to 1935, 50 years of littered with broken promises of increasing responsible self-government to bring us on a par with the so-called white dominions, people like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, which enjoyed a dominion status and a level of representative self-government that India was consistently denied. So example after example, I'm afraid, only confirm that the British talked a good game, broke their promises, and instead ruled India quite ruthlessly for their own benefit.
Shashi, you just have to walk on the streets of an Indian city or anywhere in India to see what a remarkably young country India is.
Right.
And just today happens to be, I think, yesterday marked the 20th anniversary of Princess Diana's death, as we know. And I was reading an interesting poll that said that people who were born after Diana's death simply consider her to be someone who died in a car crash rather than the emotional attachment that many other people have to the princess when she was alive. So fast forwarding to India today, to the young population of India, what is the antidote to the religious extremism, to the crackdown on, gay rights and so on, the parlous state of education, infrastructure, unemployment? I was very discomfited reading your book, but I'm so glad I read it because I feel so much better informed. But it still leaves the question in my mind as to what of the future and how are we going to change things?
Right. Well, as I said, I've written that in other books, but I will stress that it seems to me the only viable future for India is of an increasingly liberal society with increasing political rights for the marginalized and the downtrodden. Whether it's sexual minorities, who you're right have been discriminated against by law, a law imposed by the British on a society which earlier had been famously tolerant and accepting.
But we haven't changed it.
We haven't changed it.
Years.
We haven't
Why?
got rid of the colonial era sedition laws. We haven't got rid of the various other restrictions the British left us with, and it's our shame that we haven't. On top of which, of course, is the undoubted rise of intolerance and bigotry, fueled by a majoritarian Hindu nationalist party, which I think is completely overlooking the lived reality, not just of India as a whole, which is very much a plural society of multiple religions, but even of Hinduism, which is actually a much more broadly accepting faith than the votaries of Hindu nationalism would actually allow it to be.
Can I ask about that, actually? It was really interesting to me, the history of your view that the British actually entrenched divisions around caste and entrenched divisions around Islamism, being a Muslim or being a Hindu. But I'm just really curious to think about the here and now. Australians, Americans are really familiar with that, I guess, appeal to a form of, I don't know if secularism is the right word, but one nation's appeal around the issue of Islam, Donald Trump's real appeal to his voters around the issue of Islam as well. India's sort of starting
to go down that path.
Well, you've got the same problem, but on top of which, you've got an historical, you've got a real tension with Pakistan and an internal tension with one of your political parties. How do you heal that, given you've got to deal with the same modern issues we have to deal with?
Right. No, those are two separate issues, really. I think Pakistan, the problem very simply is that you've got, unfortunately, the legacy of this divide and rule policy, the creation of a separate state based on a religious identity, augmented, I'm sorry to say, by a disproportionately large military which commands more resources than the military of any other country.
I'm just saying you've got that modern problem overlaid a massive historical issue.
But in other words, Pakistan, and because, in India the state has an army and in Pakistan the army has a state, the army will constantly want to keep hostility alive towards India, whether we have a secular government in power, as we've done for most of our independence, or whether we have a Hindu nationalist government in power, as we do today. So those are separate issues. Domestically, however, Hindu nationalism is worrying. Mr. Modi's government won its magnificent majority with just 31% of the vote, because we have the first past the post system, as you do, I think. Well, as the British certainly do.
Don't.
You don't.
No, the British gave you that. We got rid of that. Yeah.
So you took more initiative to get rid of what the British had saddled you with than we did. So the problem there is, therefore, that Mr. Modi acts as if he's speaking for a majority, but I believe that a majority of the Hindu majority would much rather live with their fellow Indians of other faiths.
Deal, and I know I'm getting a little bit partisan in sort of Indian terms, but you have to deal with your country as it is, not as you wish it to be.
Exactly.
So how do you get around a media environment? India's got an extraordinary media environment, but it has the same problems ours has and America's has. How do you get past that? It's really easy. You appeal to the biggest bloc, by spreading prejudice. I mean, it's happening everywhere. How does India deal with that?
Well, it is happening, no question about that. Partly the answer lies in diversity of media. So to some degree, for example, social media gives people a voice who would not necessarily find themselves audible on mainstream media. That's one thing that's happening more and more. That's a good sign. There's also an increasing gap between the sort of Anglophone elite, as it's called, which functions at a level of cosmopolitanism and sophistication that is spurned, rejected by the dominant Hindi-speaking Hindu nationalist movement exemplified in the government. And these things do raise challenges. There's also a geographical divide. Much of Mr. Modi's appeal leaves people in my state of Kerala in the south completely cold. Beef, for example, is a very popular dish in Kerala, though I personally happen to be vegetarian. But though beef is popular in Kerala, Malayalis, people of Kerala, can't understand why in the north people are going around killing human beings in the name of protecting the cow. They find it absurd. So there are all these fissures being opened up because of the chauvinist majoritarian politics of the ruling party.
Shashi, another question. Most people, when they write, mere writers, for example, the prelude to my writing is straightening out a few paintings that aren't looking right and noticing the cobwebs and thinking, should I write or should I clean the house? You wrote this book in the palace of the King of Bhutan. What was that like? Well,
I wrote a first draft, which is about half the book in the end, because I kept adding to it and expanding. But that was simply because in my life as a politician, there is no time to write. I'm assailed from early morning to late night by visitors, phone calls, petitioners of various sorts, demands, meetings, political and social obligations, events.
So the palace of Bhutan is the only escape.
So to escape someplace where people don't know where I am and can't reach me even if they know because there's no phone number that works there, that was my escape. And I just took 12 days off and wrote 18 hours a day for 12 days and churned out a 50,000-word draft, which then I was able to add to in the following weeks and months. But just cracking the back of all that research and structuring an argument was what those 12 days enabled me to do. And I don't know if I'll constantly be able to get away. Elections are looming in India, but I do wonder if I'm ever going to get another book written without being able to make a similar escape.
You have a standing invitation back to the palace?
Well, after this book, I'm not sure that any royalty would have very kind feelings towards me.
Shashi Tharoor's book is Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. I'll actually be chatting with Shashi tomorrow evening at the Melbourne Writers' Festival. If you want to come along, you're welcome. Ranjana Srivastava is going to stick around as our co-host as well. And I mentioned Shashi is one of India's most interesting politicians. Sam Dastyari is one of Australia's most energetic politicians. There is no doubt. The ALP New South Wales Senator has written a book that tells a series of vignettes and about his life, his family's life. You might not know Sam Dastyari's parents were activists in the Iranian Revolution, and Sam Dastyari came here as a very young man. We'll get into his life story, his politics. He might have some common experiences with Shashi. We'll get to that all very, very soon.
On ABC Radio, this is The Conversation Hour.
Sam Dastyari's book is called One Halal of a Story. Sam, welcome.
Thank you. And I've got to say, it's amazing to be here, and not just with you, but with Shashi here, who's just, I mean, he's incredible. I mean, I've followed him for years. He's learned, he's experienced, he's considered, he's all these things that will make him a complete failure in Australian politics.
Oh, harsh.
I'm an Indian too, I feel.
And everything you are not. But Sam Dastyari, that was facetious of me. Let's start with your name, because you weren't born with the name Sam, and Dastyari has a great history.
No, so my Persian name was Sahand, which is a mountain in northern Iran. And when I came to Australia, I changed my name. I changed my name in a desperate attempt to try and fit in. I changed it from Sahand to Sam. And I always say this about kids. Kids want to conform. Kids want to belong. Kids want to fit in. Adults love being individual. Adults love it. Adults love being, I'm an individual because of this and that. I look back now in my 30s, I'm not that old, but look back at my cultural identity, being an Iranian, being a non-practicing Muslim. These are things that I'm proud of now. But when I was a kid, that is the last thing I wanted. And I thought that by changing my name from Sahand to Sam, some misguided sense that I'll somehow be accepted by this society. And of course, it doesn't work like that. The surname itself was completely made up as well. The idea of surnames was something that is quite Western. And it used to be your name and the town part of Iran you were from. So I would have been Sahand from Sari, son of whoever, right? And that's how you were known. And when the Brits kind of came through and the idea of kind of, when Iran wanted to move from being Persia to Iran, they went through a process where they actually started inventing surnames. So people would go in and you'd come up with a surname. And Dastiari means helping hand, which my grandfather, I know, which is what my grandfather, our great-grandfather came up with. But yeah, it's all made up, and it's very kind of interesting. Like this whole idea, like birthdays. Birthdays are a very Western concept. In Iran, your year of birth mattered.
That's it, yeah.
Your year of birth mattered. So people knew what year you were born, but the day of your birth meant nothing. So there's all these Iranians, my grandparents being great examples, when they were coming to Australia, just kind of had to invent a day. So they all chose either Christmas or Persian New Year. And all these Iranians, think of, have Persian New Year as the date of their birth, because one day everyone just decided that was your day you were born, because no one cared. It's very, very Western.
Look, you're not a traditional politician. You're not a traditional author either. It's this sort of delightful perorations around various anecdotes. If I can just raise a few of them before we get into the politics. An annual family celebration on Christmas Day at your grandmother's grave.
Yeah, it's terrible, right?
Well, it's interesting.
What's embarrassing for us, because we rock up at my grandmother's grave. And Iranians, there's only two things you do at a gravesite, right? Either you wail or you play loud Persian dance music and dance, right? And there's no in between. There's no kind of solemn kind of, this solemn kind of quiet, sit down, think and meditate. No. So Christmas Day for us is we take over we take over a cemetery with my huge family, effectively with guitars and music, and all the kids are sitting there just embarrassed.
And a lot of food.
Yeah, and a lot of food. It was a competition about food, right? Like you don't love enough if you don't bring more food than everyone else. Like it's on, right? And it's so embarrassing for us. And there is not one ethnic kid in Sydney or Melbourne who at one point in time, or across Australia, hasn't said, I am so embarrassed of my parents. I am so embarrassed. And, the statistics that came out just blew me away from the census. 40% of people born in this city, Melbourne, 40% of people in Melbourne were not born in Australia. Shows you, by an Indian comparison, that is there anything like that you've come across in the world?
Not even 1%. Well, of course, the Bangladeshi migrants may account for a modest chunk, but nothing remotely like what you're talking about.
But we're different, and even compared to America and Britain, we've got an extraordinary number of people who are either born overseas. And I think half the country's got a parent born overseas.
And also...
Half.
And what is some of them should have checked their citizenship, but too soon. But can I tell you something about the multicultural story?
Quickly, yes.
We have that's different. Australia's multiculturalism is very unique. The Americans have this thing they call the melting pot. And the idea behind the American experience is, you can become American, but you have to give up your identity. I've got Indian friends in America. If you say them to Indian American, it's almost like an insult. No, I'm an American, this and that. Here, our idea of multiculturalism is maintain your culture, maintain your identity, maintain your language where necessary. And insofar it doesn't conflict with our universal small L liberal values, you're adding to the Australian experience. That is so unique. Not to say there isn't a dark racist underbelly out there as well.
Sorry, forgive me, Ranjana. I just want to try and charge on to One Nation. I am going to ask you about you, the politician, in a moment, but as you brought up multiculturalism, there's a delightful line in the book where you're out, I think it's at Parks, and someone says to you, this is about One Nation and the support that One Nation gets, and especially in a place like that. Someone tells you that this is effectively the One Nation message. It's not that we agree, but that she pays attention. So people don't necessarily agree with everything Pauline Hanson says, but she pays them attention. Why did you think that was worthy of such significant mention?
Well, look, I think those of us on the centre-left of politics, and I think probably to the centre more broadly, make this mistake sometimes. And anyway, Pauline Hanson's a fascist. I believe she's a fascist, and I outline that in the book. I believe a lot of racists support her, but that is not her entire support. There is this sense that we became, especially in the inner cities, and especially inner city politicians, where we became quite arrogant. We became the truth of multiculturalism, the multicultural experience was so self-evident that we stopped going out there making the case. And there is huge disaffected communities. Again, you just have to look at the US, the UK, you can look around the world. Jobs being lost, industries being lost, and people being left behind. And what One Nation and others have done incredibly well incredibly well, it's provided a very simplistic answer. Now, Pauline Hanson's a sensationally good politician, but 20 years ago, her politics was about Asian migration. Australia's being flooded by Asians. That was her first speech in Parliament. 20 years later, politics has moved on. Now it's about Muslims. And, she walked into our parliament, Shashi, dressed in a burqa a week ago, which is surreal around the world, to try and explain. It made international news. But now it's about finding one group of people and placing on them the blame of what's going on in society. The easiest people to do that now is with the Muslim community. And I say to my friends from the subcontinent, 20 years from now, you're next.
Sam, we can debate this issue for hours and hours, but I have two questions that I really want to ask a politician, and there are two politicians today. So the first question is, how is it that all politicians at some point seem to invoke either God or country when entering politics, but beg family reasons when they quit politics?
Yeah. Well, look, that's very. I'll let Shashi start with that one.
Well, I haven't quit yet, Sam.
Yeah, that's right. He doesn't have to answer.
So family, and in fact, indeed, my family is profoundly away from my political life. My sons both live in the US and write. My mother regrets my ever having entered politics. So I don't really have a family to serve as an excuse the day I decide to quit. I'd have to cite books.
Yeah, but you're right about this. And the toll on families is sensational. It is. It really is incredible. And I know it's a bit kind of, first world problems, woe is me, my family, this, that. But they cop it. And so I cop it. I've had some hate come through.
You collect your hate mail.
I collect my hate mail. And, recently one of our former federal Labor leaders, Mark Latham, started doing these Facebook videos about my children, right? And my children are very, very, they look very Aussie, in the kind of traditional Anglo-Celtic kind of way. My wife is several generation British, and about how I hate white, I'm a self-hating white racist because I talk about, privilege and white privilege and whatnot, but my kids are white. And then the hate mail that started coming through to my children. Right? The stuff that started coming through my letterbox, it's unbelievable. And the unfiltered hate you have out there, it's just, you must get so much of it.
Oh, I do. And in fact, it is startling, actually, particularly thanks to social media, where having people express thoughts that they would never have had an opportunity or a forum to say these things. These were dark thoughts they kept to themselves or maybe in the privacy of their living rooms, but now it's out there.
Okay, well, for my book, I did something different. I started tracing it back. So I started working out who, because people do it under their own names. So I said, who are these people, right? So I thought, well, they can stalk me, I can stalk them, right? So I started finding out who the people were, and they do it under their own names.
And what did you expect them to be, and what did they turn out to be?
I expected there to be, let's be honest, fat blokes in their mid-40s sitting in their mother's dungeons, right? Playing PlayStation during the day, angry at the world. And you find they're actually really normal people with normal jobs. They're school teachers, they're paramedics, they're business people. And you ask yourself this, so is this what happens, right? Do they get up halfway through the day, right? They get up in the morning, drop their kids to school, help the neighbours with their shopping, jump on their computer, write hate mail about Muslims, this and that, then go back to their normal days. Like, this is the bit that I find so amazing, how this freedom of hate, and you only have to scratch the surface and you get some horrible stuff. And you must get so much more. I get the second worst hate. The worst hate goes to the female politicians.
Oh, yes.
Right?
I want to get more into hate mail, but I want to try and turn the acid onto Sam Dastyari just for a moment. His book, though, is one halal of a story. Shashi Tharoor's book is Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Ranjana Srivastava is with us as well. Sam, I do want to play the press conference. You lost your shadow front bench position over a $1,600 bill that you asked a donor to pay. Here's a part of that press conference. Just have a listen, and you might hear Lee Sales from 7:30 as well.
You've been making a name for yourself going after big corporations who've acted inappropriately and going them on transparency, accountability and whatnot. I'm just wondering, how could you be doing that in your professional life but not in your own personal career, aware of these sorts of issues?
Lee, that is an incredibly fair question. And I think what I've said, and I want to be consistent on this, my issue with some of these larger corporations, the multinationals and the banks, isn't that they make mistakes. They make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And I want to be very clear. I have made a mistake, right? And they make mistakes and we make mistakes and everyone makes. The question is, does those mistakes change your behaviour and do you learn from those mistakes?
Now, Sam, I played that because I want people to
remember.
They might remember
of
you
course.
popping up.
And that's the interesting thing about the book too. That a lot of these books that people write in politics are hagiographies. And thank you for taking the time to read it. Mine's not at all.
Let me get on to hagiography if I can. And look, you've answered questions about the donation, so I'm going to leave that stuff to the side. Let me put this to you though: your biggest problem as a politician is that you still sound like and read like someone who's, at the end of the day, you're the most important thing. You've got a lot of good intentions. You've got a lot of great ideas. You've proposed lots of really attractive policies to people, but you're still one of those politicians where at the end of the day people think, nah, you know what? He's in it for himself most of all.
I think if I was in it for myself, mate, I would have got out long ago. I think you'll find, and I don't know, Raf, you talk to politicians and that others can judge that, but I don't quite know if there's any other politician like me, and I don't mean that necessarily as a good thing, it's just a different thing.
I'm just saying it's a perception you
fair enough.
have to handle.
Fair enough, and of course it is, and everyone in politics has to handle that perception. And, and I talk about this in the book. What I say in the book is, people in politics, it's this incredibly strange business, and you're dealing with some very, very odd people, and it is a business in which you get trained, you get taught, you get built into building up these walls and barriers. And, people always ask that question, why don't politicians talk the way we do? Why aren't they speaking the way we are? Why do they use these phrases that no one else in the normal world uses? I have been, and you hear this on your radio program all the time, I have been advised that, or it's been brought to my attention. Why? Because they're so afraid of making a mistake. They're so afraid of putting a step wrong. And there are these barriers that come up. And I talk about Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd and that in the book, and people always said privately, Julia was fantastic. Why was she so horrible when you put a camera on her? Well, because the defensive barrier comes up with people, and it's the system we're in. Everyone's afraid to fail.
So Sam, following on from that clip we just heard, I have another question
Yeah,
for
of
both
course.
of you, in fact. And it's quite well known that both of you have had to step down from high public office due to various things. And I don't need to revisit what happened because I think it's documented truly well and, well. But my question for the average person like me is this: how do you recover from public failure? You are such public figures, and in this day of social media, you just have to Google your name, and there are pages and pages of information about you and about why you had to step down, both of you. How do you actually save your face and actually continue to do really well? Because I think there's a lesson in it for all of us.
So I'm going to get the razor in the bath now. This is where we're... Don't say that.
Well,
How do you pick yourself up?
in my case, I stepped down because there were a lot of ridiculous allegations made, which were palpably false. And I came back to the Council of Ministers when they were proven to be false. So that was the end of that. I just had to sort of take the unfair accusations until such time as my name could be cleared. But, I've been on the receiving end of other kinds of unfair accusations. My wife passed away a few years ago, and the media, or some nasty sections of the media, has created this entire miasma of suspicion. Mostly based on outright lies, because unfortunately fact-checking is not a great practice in mainstream Indian journalism. And I've just essentially started focusing on, I've continued to focus on my work, on my writing, on my ideas, and the contributions I'm making to the Indian national conversation. And I let the scandalmongers continue until such time as anybody in a position of authority decides to take them seriously, which so far, thank God, no one has, because it's absurd. So the thing is, in a position of visibility, which all politicians are, you do attract a lot of attention. There's an old Indian proverb that little boys like to throw stones at trees that bear fruit. So if you're out there and you're actually bearing fruit,
I'm going to use that. That is fantastic.
They will throw stones at you to bring those fruit down. And I'm just going to have to show that I can take those stones occasionally and carry on doing what I believe is the right thing to do.
But what
Sam?
is that?
Oh.
Yep,
And I'll just jump in quickly. Yeah. Look, also, failure is part of your story. Failure is part of your story.
Yeah, no, it is.
I'm sick and tired of this idea that we have, that everyone in politics, everything's right, everything's perfect, everything's that. That's rubbish.
But it's the story you create.
It is.
It's the story you front up with.
And you need to, right? And you need to be prepared. If you're in politics and you're in public life, you accept that there are rules of the game. And they're not fair, they're not nice. In the world of social media, the bit that is so amazing is the pace of it. Things go from being a slow breeze on your face to being this full sudden cyclone within 6 hours, and then 2 days later it goes. Everything is so fast in politics, and at the end of it, it leaves you there, and you start asking questions and you go, what am I going to do? And then you write a book.
A quick question to both of you. I've got to wrap up soon, but are you less sure about the way politics works now than you were? Because it seems to me everything, the media, all businesses are so disrupted. I just wonder if you feel less certain about your own business as you get older. Shashi?
Well, in my case, very much so, because I actually wrote about Indian politics from the outside, and I realized that I had the view of the wood but not of the trees. And having come down to the trees and indeed found myself toiling in the weeds, I can tell you it's a very different game indeed, and often not in a pleasant way. In fact, for the most part, the reality is much worse than the theory.
So I have a slightly different view. I'm more sure now, and what I'm sure about is this. You have to be who you are. They will just see through the rubbish, the bullshit, whatever you want to call it. You have to be who you are. If you are who you are in this day and age, with social media, with other opportunities of messaging, with the way you can get things out, you will succeed in politics. That's the one rule.
Look, I've got to say I have not read books like this before. They were both incredibly rewarding. Sam Dastyari's is one halal of a story. It's eye-opening about politics, and if you want to have your mind blown, read Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, about what the British did to India. He is at the Melbourne Writers' Festival tomorrow night as well. Ranjana Srivastava has been my co-host on The Conversation Hour.
The people.
Everyone is friendly.
People are genuinely interested in you here.
Very warm, pleasant, approachable,
and they're just friendly. And it's the only place I've ever stopped at a crossing and somebody's asked how my day was going.
This is ABC Radio Melbourne.